Okay, I want you to try a little experiment with me. Just close your eyes for a second and picture the start of America, the very beginning.
I think I know where this is going.
You do,
Yeah,
don't you? Because
fine.
it's almost always the same picture. It's gray skies, Plymouth Rock, 1620. A lot of very serious people in buckle hats.
The first Thanksgiving.
Right, and we love that story. It's clean. It's all about religious freedom and, deep conviction.
It's a very comforting founding myth. The thing is, if we're sticking to the actual timeline of English colonies, that story is about 13 years too late.
Exactly. To find the real beginning, the messy, chaotic, just absolute train wreck of a beginning, we have to go back to 1607, to Jamestown. And having read our source for today, this was not a pious pilgrimage.
Not even a little bit.
Yeah.
We're looking at the tobacco economy, Survival and Exploitation in Jamestown by Kyle Iorio. And the picture Iorio paints is, well, it's less religious retreat and more Silicon Valley startup gone horribly, horribly wrong.
That's the analogy that kept popping into my head. A startup from hell. It's a private corporation, the Virginia Company of London, and they're just burning through cash, making terrible hiring decisions, and then pivoting at the last possible second to avoid total bankruptcy.
It really is the perfect frame for it. And what's so fascinating about Iorio's work is his core argument. He says Jamestown didn't survive because the settlers were brave or built a stable society. They survived because they stumbled onto a drug economy.
We're talking about tobacco, the original cash crop.
Right. But it's not just that they grew a plant. It's that they reorganized their entire society, their laws, their land use, their whole labor system, all of it around producing this one highly addictive commodity.
And the cost of that pivot, it was astronomical. We're going to get into all of it. From settlers literally eating their own boots during the starving time to this multi-million-dollar boom that, ended up entrenching slavery. But before we get to the green gold, we have to talk about the seed round, if we're sticking with that startup analogy.
The seed round. I like that.
So the Virginia Company of London, this isn't the British government funding this, right? It's a business.
Strictly business. It's a joint stock company. So think of it like modern shareholders. You have all these wealthy merchants and aristocrats in London pooling their money.
And they expect a return on that investment.
They absolutely expect an ROI. They aren't donating this money.
So what was the business plan? What was the pitch?
In one word, gold. They saw what the Spanish were doing down in South America, looting Aztec and Inca gold, and they basically said, we want in on that.
So the settlers, they weren't sent there to farm.
No, and this is a crucial point Uriel makes. The talent they recruited wasn't agricultural. They sent goldsmiths, jewelers, and a lot of gentlemen.
And a gentleman in the 17th century was?
Someone who was literally defined as a person who did not work with their hands.
That seems like a massive hiring error if you're dropping people into a literal swamp.
It was a complete disaster. You've got this group arriving in a humid, malarial environment, and instead of, building sturdy houses or planting corn for the winter, they're just wandering up and down the riverbanks looking for gold nuggets.
Because the investors are back in London tapping their watches asking, where's my profit?
Exactly. The pressure from the board of directors drove all the behavior on the ground. And this total misalignment leads us straight to one of the darkest chapters in early American history, the winter of 1609 to 1610.
The starving time.
It's a phrase we hear a lot, but I don't think we usually pause to really understand what it meant.
Iorio goes into some really graphic detail, and I think we need to sit with it for a second. We're not just talking about being hungry.
No. This was total societal collapse. They had alienated the local Powhatan Confederacy, so they couldn't trade for food. Relations were so bad, the settlers who left the fort to hunt were often just picked off. They were tracked.
Trapped inside the fort, and the food runs out. The source mentions the social contract just evaporated.
Completely. Iorio describes settlers literally tearing down their own houses for firewood because they were too weak to go out and chop wood.
And then they started on the animals.
First the horses,
Yeah.
then dogs, cats,
And the rats.
rats, mice, snakes, anything that moved.
And the leather.
Yeah, that detail. It always stops me cold. They were boiling their own boots, boiling the leather from their belts, just trying to extract some kind of, gelatinous protein from the hide. That's the level of desperation we're talking about.
It's such a bleak picture, just sitting in a freezing hut chewing on your own shoe because the business plan was find gold instead of grow wheat.
And the mortality rate reflects that. The source lays out the numbers. In autumn of 1609, there were about 500 settlers.
Okay.
By May of 1610, there were maybe 60 left.
500 down to 60. That's a total liquidation. I mean, if this were a modern company, the website just goes dark.
And they actually tried to. In 1610, the survivors boarded their ships and they started sailing down the James River. They were abandoning Jamestown for good. It was over.
That's wild. We came that close to the whole English experiment in America just ending.
That's another failed outpost.
Yeah.
But as they're sailing out, they run into a relief fleet coming in from England. They're ordered to turn back. And this is the moment. This is where the startup pivots. They finally accept the gold isn't there. They need a new product.
And here comes the co-founder with the big idea, John Rolfe.
John Rolfe.
Yeah.
Now, most people know him because he married Pocahontas, which is a whole other story. But in economic terms, Rolfe is the guy who saves the company.
He's a product guy.
He is. He looks at the local Virginia tobacco, which the native people smoked, but the English hated it. It was harsh, bitter, just not a good consumer product.
So bad market feedback.
Terrible reviews.
Yeah.
But Rolfe, he gets his hands on some seeds from the Caribbean Nicotiana tobacco, which was the sweet, smooth stuff the Spanish were monopolizing.
And it was illegal to export those seeds, right? This is basically corporate espionage.
Oh, absolutely. So he smuggles these seeds in, plants them in Virginia soil, and bingo.
Product market fit.
Perfect product market fit. It grew incredibly well. It was sweet, it was mild, and most importantly, it was incredibly addictive.
But here's the part that I find so darkly funny. The CEO, or in this case, the King of England, James I, he despised the product.
He was the original anti-smoking campaigner. The source quotes him. He called smoking loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. He was not subtle.
So he's basically the Surgeon General of 1610 saying, this stuff will kill you.
But here's a lesson every capitalist learns. Moral outrage is pretty much powerless against massive consumer demand.
People just didn't care what the king said.
Not one bit. Smoking became trendy in London. It was a status symbol. Demand just skyrocketed. And for the Virginia company, this was the miracle they'd been praying for.
Let's talk numbers, because the scale of this boom that Iorio lays out, it's just staggering. We go from eating shoes to shipping massive tonnage almost overnight.
The growth curve is basically vertical. By 1617, so just 7 years after the starving time, Jamestown ships 20,000 pounds of tobacco.
And what was that worth in sort of modern terms?
Well, it's always tricky to translate, but Iorio estimates that shipment was worth something like $500,000 to $1 million today.
From a colony that was basically a graveyard a few years earlier.
And that was just the start. Within 10 years, exports hit 1.5 million pounds a year.
That's tens of millions of dollars pouring into this tiny settlement on the edge of the known world.
It's a gold rush. It just happens to be green. But when you have that kind of money flooding a place with no real infrastructure or regulation, things get weird.
Which brings us to the mania. Iorio describes the atmosphere in Jamestown during this boom as almost frantic.
It was a monoculture mania. The source describes how basically every other economic activity just stopped. No one's building fences. No one's repairing the fort.
Everyone is just planting tobacco.
Everyone. And everywhere. There's that one image in the text that just, I had to reread it.
You're thinking of the cemetery.
The streets, the public squares, and between the graves in the cemetery.
They were planting a cash crop between the graves of the people who had just died starving.
It's the ultimate symbol of the obsession, isn't it? It shows the psychology. Nothing matters but getting this leaf in the ground.
But this obsession creates a brand new crisis, what the source calls the food paradox.
Right. You have these planters who are technically rich. They have all this tobacco in the shed, but they're on the brink of starvation again.
Because you can't eat tobacco.
You can't eat it. And the market incentives were so skewed towards tobacco that no one wanted to waste time and land growing corn.
It's a classic market failure. Individual greed leading to collective ruin.
It got so bad, the colonial government had to step in with really heavy-handed regulation. They passed laws saying for every acre of tobacco you plant, you have to plant 2 acres of corn.
They had to literally force people to feed themselves.
They did.
Yeah.
But there's another cost to this mania, an environmental one. Tobacco is what's called a heavy feeder.
It just destroys the soil.
It's a nutrient vampire. Sucks everything right out of the earth. So you plant a field for 3, maybe 4 years, and then it's dead. It's just dust.
So this creates a constant need for new land. You can't stay put.
You have to expand. And this is where the whole startup analogy turns into a geopolitical tragedy. This need for fresh soil turned the English colony into an expansionist machine.
So it wasn't just we want more land for glory. It was we need more land to keep the revenue flowing.
Precisely. And that land wasn't empty. It belonged to the Powhatan Confederacy. Iorio draws a direct line here. Soil exhaustion led to encroachment, and encroachment led to war. The brutality of those conflicts was driven by an economic imperative.
So the plant consumes the soil, which forces the settlers to consume their neighbor's land. But there's one more piece missing. You have the land, the seeds, the market. Who's doing the actual work?
That's the bottleneck. Tobacco farming is unbelievably labor-intensive. You're pruning, weeding, picking worms off by hand, harvesting leaf by leaf. It's backbreaking.
And the gentlemen are definitely not doing it.
Not a chance. So the first solution was indentured servitude.
Can we just break down how that worked? Because I think people sometimes confuse it with slavery.
It was a contract. A poor young man in London with no prospects signs an indenture. It says, I'll work for you in Virginia for, say, 7 years. In exchange, you pay for my passage, you feed me, and at the end of it, I'm free, and I might get a small plot of land.
A temporary labor lease.
Exactly. And for a while, it worked. But as the tobacco boom exploded, the demand for labor just completely outstripped the supply of poor Englishmen willing to sign up.
So the labor supply is drying up, but the demand for it is skyrocketing.
And this brings us to 1619, the pivot point for labor.
The arrival of the ship with 20 and odd Africans.
Right. A Dutch ship shows up, carrying Africans they'd captured from a Portuguese slave ship, and they trade them to the Jamestown settlers for supplies.
Now, the source makes a really interesting point here about ambiguity. It says their status wasn't immediately clear.
That's a nuance that's often missed. In 1619, Virginia didn't actually have a legal code for slavery. It didn't exist in English law. So some of those first Africans were actually treated like indentured servants. We have records of them working their term and gaining their freedom.
So for a very brief moment, it wasn't inevitable. It wasn't a given that this would become a racial caste system.
It wasn't inevitable, but it was, and I use this word carefully, it was economically efficient for the planters. And this is where the story gets incredibly dark.
The shift from ambiguity to hard and fast laws.
As the planters got richer, they realized that indentured servants were a bad investment. Think about it. You pay to bring someone over, you train them, and then after 7 years, right when they're at their most productive, they leave. And then they become your competition.
Bad for business.
Terrible for business. But a slave never leaves. A slave's children also belong to you. It's a permanent capital asset.
I hate hearing it put that way, but that is the cold logic of the source material.
It is. Iorio explains the shift to racialized chattel slavery wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate legal construction. Over the next few decades, the Virginia elites passed law after law to close every loophole. They made servitude for Africans permanent. They made it hereditary. They tied it directly to skin color.
They built a legal wall around a labor force.
Because the tobacco economy demanded it. To maintain those huge profit margins, they decided to cut the cost of labor to zero. The success of Jamestown, the wealth that built Virginia, was directly extracted from this coerced labor.
It really reframes that whole survival narrative we started with. Jamestown survived, yes, but the how is deeply disturbing.
That's the core takeaway for me. Jamestown survived, but not because it stabilized or became healthy. It survived by becoming this addictive machine, just burning through soil and burning through human lives.
The author uses the phrase survival without stability.
It was perfect. It was a society always teetering on the edge, always needing more land, more bodies, just to keep the whole system from collapsing.
And the tragedy is that this model, the plantation model, it didn't stay in Jamestown.
No, it became the operating system for the entire American South. You can draw a straight line from John Rolfe's tobacco seeds in 1612 to the massive cotton empires of the 19th century and eventually to the Civil War.
It's heavy stuff. It makes you realize you can't just look at GDP or export numbers to judge if a society is, successful.
Right. A spreadsheet for Jamestown in 1630 would look amazing. Revenue's up, exports are through the roof. But underneath all that data, the foundation was just rotting.
Well, this has certainly been a deep dive in every sense. We've gone from eating shoe leather to building an empire on smoke.
It's a reminder that history isn't usually about heroes and villains. It's about incentives. It's about what people will do to survive and how those choices just echo for centuries.
Which brings us to the thought I want to leave you with today. We've spent this time analyzing a 400-year-old tobacco economy, a system that generated massive wealth but locked a society into these incredibly destructive patterns.
It really forces the question, what are our tobacco economies today?
Exactly. Look around. What are the industries right now that are incredibly profitable, that are kind of keeping the lights on for the global economy, but are also quietly locking us into cycles of instability, whether it's, environmental debt or social inequality. Are we just planting tobacco between the graves all over again?
That is the question to mull over.
On that cheery note, thank you for listening. This has been The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.